So the supply of loanable funds is created by potential savers. As the interest rates rise, the quantity of funds that savers are going to put in the bank will increase. As interest rates fall, the quantity of funds that they'll put in the bank for loanable funds will decrease. So we've learned from chapter 10, and we're covering it real quick, that as interest rates say something like the shift in the supply of money goes outward, we'll actually find lower interest rates, and the quantity of funds that are going to be loaned is now increased. So market determines equilibrium quantity. Quantity saved by the savers is equal to quantity invested by the investor. Quantity equal to the quantity borrowed by borrowers. And the equilibrium price, the price of that money, is called the interest rate. So, if we talked about it, if the Fed expands the money supply to S prime, so the money supply is shifted outward, is now increased, what we'll find is interest rates fall, as it shows here, as we kind of went over just a few seconds ago, and the quantity of loans made increases, as we can see right here. So the result of the increased loan activity, more houses are built and more cars are bought. Lower interest rates encourage more people to start buying more. So we have a level of economic activity that starts to increase. As a result, so if the level of economic activity starts to increase, as it goes up, we see more prosperity. We see unemployment begin to decrease. We have an increase in economic activity, which is what we want. A decrease in unemployment, which is another great thing for the country, for the macroeconomy. But the resulting fact is increased inflation. Why is inflation going up? Well, it's because the aggregate demand is going up, as we mentioned before in this lecture series. An increase. So what is aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is the total demand for all goods within the economy. They lump it all together and call it the aggregate demand. So an increase in the money supply will cause an outward shift in the demand for stuff like tractors, houses, pickups, just about everything. So an increase in the money supply encourages more people to buy more things. It encourages economic growth. It lowers unemployment. And more people are now demanding more things, to where the total aggregate demand will increase. So an increase in the money supply will cause an outward shift in the aggregate demand. So the definition for aggregate demand, the total quantity of goods and services that will be purchased at alternative price levels. How much are you willing, or the demand for everything, for pretty much all goods and services within a macroeconomy. Aggregate supply. What is the aggregate supply? It mirrors the aggregate demand, but it's talking about on the supply side. It is the total quantity of goods and services that will be produced at alternative price levels. So the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply is a relationship. With aggregate demand, it's a relationship between the total amount of demand in an economy at different price levels. The aggregate supply is the total amount of supply that is willing to be produced at different price levels. It again is a relationship. So how do the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply relate to each other to affect inflation? So inflation may worsen at the same time employment and growth rate improve. Well, let's talk about this one real quick. How do aggregate demand and aggregate supply relate to each other to affect inflation? Well, I'm going to see if I can draw a decent little graph right here in the middle. If we have price and quantity, we have the aggregate demand right here. We have the aggregate supply right here. Well, if the demand for everything is increasing because of the low interest rates and everybody can go out and buy stuff now, the increase in the money supply increases the aggregate demand for goods. We could see aggregate demand that increase and prices increase. An increase in prices across the whole economy is considered inflation. So as aggregate demand increases, we find that inflation increases. So, inflation may worsen at the same time that employment and growth improve. In the 1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson was in Vietnam and starting many expensive social programs at home. There was not enough federal money for what was needed. So, what happened? The Treasury debt created more money. Employment rose, economic growth took place. Just for the reasons that we've been talking about this whole time. The money supply increased, encouraging people or decreasing interest rates, encouraging more people to start buying more things. And because more people needed more items, people needed more production, employment rose, unemployment fell in order to utilize more resources. Economic took place, but inflation became a huge problem. For that same reason, now that because of the productivity and the increased demand, the aggregate demand went up and causing prices to increase. So President Johnson did not even try to get reelected in his second term. Why? Well, one part was the American public had a distaste of the Vietnam War by that time, had a distaste of his war in the Southeast Asia, and then on top of that, inflation became a huge, real problem. But how do you battle inflation? Well, you pretty much do the opposite of what got into this inflationary state. The only way to battle inflation is to set the machine in reverse. An inward shift of the supply of loanable funds. A decrease in the money supply is the only way to really battle inflation. But what happens whenever you decrease inflation and you decrease the money supply? What that does is it actually decreases economic growth, actually puts economic growth backwards, and it increases unemployment. So that leads to what is called an economic recession. And this is a period of time when the real economic growth is negative. It's negative. Why? Because the money supply is decreasing, interest rates start going up, discouraging production. Because there's less production, there's less need for jobs. So unemployment begins to rise, but the demand for goods, the aggregate demand for goods begins to fall, decreasing inflation. In the next video, we'll begin talking about or we will continue on with this discussion.